It's more an privilege dus a bheithin seo a nocht agus gur míle maithigh as an charú a hort dú. It's a great privilege for me to be here, and I'm really delighted on a number of levels, not least because of the academic opportunity to come over and share some of my research with some very, very renowned students from the accounts from Owen and from a very esteemed Irish community here in Villanova. There's a personal element for me here also, I suppose, in that my father's family would have emigrated, many of them, to Philadelphia many moons ago, and in fact many of them are buried over here, so didn't make it back to the homeland. And as well as that, when I was talking to my sister when I was coming here and I mentioned the university, I was thinking of Villanova in the context of the academic Villanova and in the context of Owen being here. And my sister very nicely informed me, do you realise that most of your cousins' families all attended Villanova? So it's a really great privilege for me to be here on many accounts, and I'm delighted to avail of this. So looking at hybrid identities, Irish language revival and media in the US and Ireland, just to give you a brief synopsis of my own research. My research is really focused on the revival period, which is a period that spans mainly from about 1880 until about 1940. Now, on our understandings of revival to date and what we have seen, this seems to be very rooted in an Irish mindset, but further research, particularly in media sources, has led us to a completely different pathway, which is actually more transatlantic, being rooted perhaps in the States and coming to Ireland as opposed to the other way around. And I'm actually at the moment in the process of putting a proposal together to do some research on this in the global context of the revival and the European links as well as the transatlantic. In Ireland at the moment as well, we're in the middle of the celebrations for the Decade of Centenaries, which is the 1913 to 1923 period, when Ireland was really agog with many, many political developments, with many, many movements, one of them being the cultural revival. And in that context, I am looking at how the revival was implemented. I have written on this and done a lot on this to date, but looking further on it, current thought on Irish language, the global international transatlantic context and the media-based context. So this has brought me to this hybrid identity, that the Gael was not just the Irish Gaeldom, from the Irish Gaeldom that we associate them with, and that this is based possibly on a historically based mindset and also on a dual language approach, not necessarily bilingual, but dual language. And in fact, as I've said in one of my own quotes, the dual language approach added further substance to the notion of Gaelic identity as being rooted in both linguistic domains, English and Irish, and both linguistic cultures in that context. The conflict therefore lay in the historical approach of the revival, returning to our roots. What was native? What was Irish? And as Brian O'Croher, who is in Notre Dame here, or Notre Dame, Brian has said in his book, it did not represent a return to the antiquarianism of the Gael or a primitive viewpoint, but rather looking back, as almost every group in Europe did, in order to consider the crisis of nationhood and to understand the negative and industrial and economic influence that followed linguistic change and the abandonment of language. There's much of that in the revival literature and in the revival media, that revival of language is associated with economic and industrial development as well, and this is throughout a lot of the revival movements in Europe. And certainly we have to look at this in the context of, even in Ireland today, in the context of what is happening. So going back to the very roots of the revival then, so looking at this is the advertisement that was in the first Gaelic journal for Conradh Gaelic. We can see the absolute premise on which it was founded, which was a dual language, Conradh the Gaelic League, 4 College Green, chahar a bhaiche an choiste amalia clia. So we see it word for word. And again, Uachtaran Douglas the Hija, President Douglas Hyde. So we see that this was the premise, and they understood immediately that English was going to be a necessary medium to try to promote the language. So, and just to look at where we're starting, and I deliberately just put these in to contextualise this, and I know many of you have been to Ireland, but perhaps many of you haven't also, and I'm not sure if all of you have ever actually been familiar with where the Gaelic League actually started. And on the left-hand side, on your left, or I'm not sure, but the Gaelic League, the objectives of the Gaelic League are there, and they are as they were put together in 1893. And as we see again, it was through English this was done. And on the side, it's my right, probably your left, you can just about make out Conradh na Gaeilge on the little glass piece above the door, and that is where Conradh na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic League, is housed today. Now, can everybody hear me? I just want to make sure I'm speaking loud enough. That's okay. So that is where it is housed today, and it's still very vibrant. And just recently we have had a restructuring of all the movements in Irish in Ireland, and from 19 organisations they have been consolidated into 6 organisations, but one of the organisations that came through out of that was Conradh na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic League. But they have moved on now to be a more proactive league for language issues, as opposed to being the old historic mindset that they had. So the Gaelic League, the organisation for the National Irish Language Movement, was officially founded on Monday, 31st of July 1893, in number 9 Lower Sackville Street in Dublin, Ireland, in a meeting called by a young scholar called Owen MacNeill. And the seeds for the movement had been sown for some time. This is Owen MacNeill. Some of you may recognise him. He was subsequent to this, he was a professor of history in the university where I now lecture in UCD. And one of the articles that was in the main Irish language newspaper in 1913, The North Began, which is there, and the main Irish language newspaper was on Clive Sullish, which you can see there also. But apparently this article was one of the articles which was which resulted in the founding of the Irish Volunteers, which of course led on to the 1916 Rising and everything else that followed. So he was quite a thinker and quite a writer. And I think that's one of the main things that's coming to the fore for me with this revival research that I'm doing. We look on revival always in the context of our speakers, as we should do, but also I would see that sometimes in that the writings, some of them which are very, very profound, are left to the side. And some of the writings, particularly in journalistic forums, are quite insightful as to the mindset which was the blueprint that really formed the Irish state from 1922 onwards, followed by and founded by these leaders of the revival movement. So, and one of this was, some of the Gaelic League movement was actually premised on the relationship between Douglas Hyde as founder of the Gaelic League and Owen MacNeill, another founder of the Gaelic League, but also the founder of the Volunteers. But while there was dissent between them at various periods, in 1938, the end of the revival, when Douglas Hyde was elected as the first president of Ireland, he was asked to write the preface for Owen MacNeill's Fellscreeving, or what we would call maybe the celebration of his life's work, his testimonial, if you like. And in it he wrote, on the 14th of October 1938, he simply but generously described Owen MacNeill's contribution to Irish cultural life and scholarship. And I'm translating, most of what I'm saying today is translated. You were the historian who shed the most light on the old state of this country. You were the advisor whose advice on Gaelic League affairs was never without benefit. You were the worker who worked night and day for this country, and today you are one of the world's great scholars. So very mutual feeling of friendship and warmth between these two leaders. Hyde addresses MacNeill as both a friend of the Irish people, a Chara na Nail, and as faithful master, a Waistir Eilish, and signed the letter, your old friend, not yours sincerely. This was the start of his testimonial. It was very, very personal in its approach. The Cheann Chara. The friendship, mutual respect and shared scholarly interests of Hyde and MacNeill are indicative of what formed much of the basis for the scholarly ideology which prevailed in the revival period, particularly in the early years of the 20th century. And this letter was penned shortly after, as I said, Hyde's inauguration as President of Ireland. His reference to MacNeill's work for our people, our Nini, indicates his recognition of the part MacNeill played in reaching that significant part in Irish history. So, at that first meeting, accounts indicate that there were 10 people present for the founding of the organisation, the Gaelic League, along with one reporter for the newspaper of the United Irishman. Clearly, the significance of the meeting was not fully understood, however, as there are conflicting reports on who was present and even on which date it was held. Much work preceded the meeting, and while one of the main aims of the language revival was to create an Irish reading public, this reading public's ideas and the leaders of the movement which would make this happen would certainly have been influenced by many of the writings which thinkers and philosophers from the 19th century had been influenced by, and prior to that, who first raised really the notion of a Gaelic League idea without framing it directly in these terms. This was not something that 10 men came together, and it was 10 men, there were no women at that time present, even though the Gaelic League was one of the most egalitarian movements, but that they came together and decided, yes, we're going to revive the language. We're going to start this movement to revive the language. There were movements and organisations that had preceded this in the 19th century, of course. But to do this was quite phenomenal at the time. And to think of it in those terms is to think of it perhaps in narrow terms, because there was no doubt, but they were influenced by the movements in Europe prior to that in the 18th and 19th century, and the prolific writings that were coming from Europe with regards to the formation of a nation, what was part of a nation, was language even to be included as part of the concept of a nation. So these were all the precedents on which it was set. It was founded in the terms of a very hybrid identity. And as to the state of play in the language prior to this, Daly and Dixon summarise this aptly, and I won't have time today to go through everything that I'm putting up here. I don't want to keep you for more than an hour, and so I will leave you to read some of this yourselves as we're going through. But this correlates to what was said earlier on the influence of language and revival on industrial and economic affairs. So I will read these because I think they're important to set the scene. The Irish language was progressively excluded from the worlds of commerce, politics, official religion, the professions and printed world as a result of complex socio-economic and political circumstances. And although Gaelic literature survived in oral and manuscript form, some of the manuscripts which are here actually, the overwhelming majority of Gaelic speakers remained illiterate. And Garvan, linguistically the country was transformed from 1847 to 1947. The language of the masses changed from Irish to English, and literacy in English replaced the non-literate use of Irish. To change language entailed changing cultural worlds. Now that is important as we move on, I'll be discussing this later. And millions migrated mentally from the medieval Gaelic world to the modern world of the English language. Due to the development of thought that these writing forums provided and developed for more than 200 years, if we start with the first Irish language journal, you have it here on my left, your right, Bullock and Tuller. This was founded in Belfast in 1795. And interesting that it was founded in Belfast, not in Dublin, not in Galway, not in Mayo, not in Donegal, not in Kerry, in Belfast. So I think this is very interesting in its own right, and it was part of the Northern Star newspaper. That was the way it was produced. But also we can see Irish songs translated by Miss Brooke, and we see on the other side the book by Lisa Newunalya on Charlotte Brooke's Relics of Irish Poetry. That was one of the most groundbreaking works that was done at the time to edit Irish songs and translate them into English back in the 1700s at the end of the 18th century. That was quite phenomenal, and to include that, it showed perhaps the scholarly approach that was going to be adopted. Now, Bullock and Tuller also, it was edited by a scribe in County Down by the name of Patrick Lynch. And this is another thing that's very important about the Irish language, because there actually have been books written about Bullock and Tuller. And it was when I started my own research, I was looking at this, and there was a lot of reference to Pádraig Ó Lynch and Patrick Lynch, but it actually wasn't the same Patrick Lynch at all. So in fact, this had to be corrected, that they're actually, the Patrick Lynch that was involved in Bullock and Tuller was a scribe, a school teacher from County Down, who actually started this. Now, there was only one edition. He had hoped that there would be more, but definitely there was, from the outset of the journalistic forum, it was a protest or a reply to the authorities, and that was the type of journalistic mindset in which these journals were founded in the early 19th century and late 18th century, but the first one is in 1795 in Bullock and Tuller. Irish language writing and the milieu in which Irish language was fostered as a medium of communication and administration allowed that it had a role to play in the foundation of the Irish state. The new school of thought, which was formed in the embryonic stages of the foundation of the Irish state as a result of the creation of a writing public, meant that a forum was also created and secured for generations of literary writers through the medium of Irish and indeed English. An overview of these writers in the mid-20th century, including Sean O'Riordan, Marcin O'Kane, Marcin O'Gerain, Owen O'Tourish, Brendan O'Heher, for example, indicates not only the creation of a modern literature, but the creation of a new school of thought, which was inclusive of Irish language content. This allowed Irish to be reinstated as a literary language. This, in turn, was one of the avenues through which the hybrid identity would be developed. Ireland was not alone in the revival mindset, and it would appear that revival movements in Europe, particularly in Hungary, Poland and Iceland, mirror the thought which developed where literature and writing forums were valued. If this is the case, however, how do we reconcile the benchmarks by which language revival is monitored and assessed as being rooted solely in oral language, with its success assessed by the number of speakers? The criteria used for assessment of language revival is mainly oral language, but the aims of the revival movement to create an Irish reading public and create a modern literature, and the prolific amount of written material available to support the movement needs an in-depth analysis in assessing the revival concept. Within these sources, with the fixity of print in particular, did the language become fixed in the psyche of the new state, and was the reverse also true, that the state became fixed in the language? To some extent, in the current climate of technological change, language is more loosely linked rather than fixed in a particular culture or mindset. And I will argue today that the foundation of the Gaelic League and the language revival was linked to some extent with a fixed concept of nation building, which was European and global in outlook and did not recognise fully the integration of European and global borders. The reliance and interdependence of Europe and the US in particular was always deemed an important aspect of the revival process. This was evident in the writings at the time and throughout the 20th century, almost until the onset of the World Wide Web in 1989. The practical implementation of the revival meant that the revival of language relied predominantly on the education system and formal avenues of administration. It has been argued by Brian O'Keefe and John Horgan, the media ombudsman in Ireland and professor of media in DCU, in particular that there was an over-reliance on these platforms, but we need only to view the prolific amount of quality Irish language writers, and indeed Irish writers writing in English, to assess their input into Irish, European and American global societies to measure the impact of this creation of a hybrid identity with the degree of success of this cultural and language movement. Viewing it in the context of native speakers alone disregards the basic philosophy behind the language movement and Gaelic League as evidenced in writings of the journals of the 19th century in particular. Fíor Éireannach, Ancient Ireland in Tipperary and in Waterford, Bullock and Tuller, the Ecclesiastical Record, the Dublin University Review, the Gaelic Journal, for example. Forums which were used by future Irish leaders as platforms for thought on the future of the nation and the language. The Irish language revival movement fostered many developments in the 20th century which ensured a place for it in the identity of the Irish people, ranging from the ability to say a greeting in Irish, Go dé mar atatu, to writing a book. This is a momentous achievement by any standards for a language that was considered dead for 300 years. While the revival may not be classified as being 100% successful, it would be remiss to not acknowledge these successes. Why then is there such doubt as to the value of the language in current Irish society? Why then is revival not acknowledged, as Sean O'Toole states? Finally, one must remember that, and this was Professor Sean O'Toole in University College Cork in 1972, In the act of revival itself, we are engaged in a new and absolutely audacious human and intellectual venture, the very planning of which and the very execution of which will of itself help to give our culture a new dimension of experience and a new quality of its own. In fact, we are undertaking a cultural task the like of which was probably never before attempted by democratic means. It is more than likely indeed that the Gaelic League idea was one of the most exciting long-term ideas ever broached anywhere, but nobody in recent times has really presented it to the Irish people in these terms. There were some specific aspects which dictated the route and the direction that this movement would take, not least the transatlantic influence which preceded the foundation of the Gaelic League by almost 50 years. This ensured the preservation and nurturing of not only a generation of writers, but a generation of thinkers. To examine the context of revival and hybrid identities, today we will look at the roots of how this thought started with Hyde's diaries, in particular Douglas Hyde, who I mentioned earlier as the founder of the Gaelic League. First of all, I will review Hyde's diary musings starting in 1878, prior to the founding of the Gaelic League in 1893, onwards to his New York visit and on his way back from the year he spent in Canada, which laid the foundation for the school of thought which crossed the Atlantic in 1892 through print journalistic forums to form the basis for the Gaelic League. Of course, I had a particular interest in this myself because I was fortunate enough to spend a year in Canada as an Ireland-Canada University Foundation professor in 2011 to 12, and I felt very much that I was retracing some of the steps that Hyde had, even though he was in New Brunswick and I was in Halifax. But I was very interested in tracing the language in, or as Sarah McMonigal says it, finding the language in Canada. Secondly, I'll examine the Irish language usage in the English press. So I'll start with looking at some of Hyde's diary entries and the manuscript work. Secondly, looking at the Irish language usage in the English press in Ireland as opposed to the pre-revival and revival journals, tracing its links to the States. And finally, looking at the immigrant press in the States with a brief overview, concluding with the notion of hal, which means there, and awas, which means here. And there was one of the titles that was used, all of the titles, in fact, that were used in these journals never referred to the States on their own or Ireland on their own. It was always hal agus awas, there and here, and don her and don here, the Eastern world, the Western world, and so forth, which disregarded the linguistic borders for the Irish emigrant. So looking at Douglas Hyde, and we have a few images of Douglas Hyde. This is a more scholarly Douglas Hyde. A minister's son, born in 1860 in French Park in Roscommon and a founder of the Gaelic League, he was one of the first to acknowledge the richness of the language idiom when he demonstrated in his collection and analysis of Áurainn Ghra Huige Connacht, the love songs of Connacht, that this peasant language had in fact preserved the poetic roots of the Irish language, elevating it to a different level of usage and understanding. If the poetry still existed in the spoken language and it could be transferred to print and written language through careful methods of recording and preservation, then clearly the Irish language still had a role to play in the understanding of Irish identity and would perhaps be the cornerstone in the new literary culture of the revival movement. Hyde was chosen as the first Gaelic League president on the 4th of August 1893 and remained in that role until the Ardèche of 1915 in Dundalk. And that's why this is actually quite a poignant time, 1915, because this is actually the time in August of that year in the Ardèche when he was more or less, he didn't run again, but he was more or less ousted as president of the Gaelic League because of the political element that was coming into the Gaelic League at the time. Indeed, it is claimed that an account of his life until 1915 is almost the same as telling the history of the Gaelic League. That is how embedded in his thought process it was. And in Anyam.ie, it's the online biographical entry, dictionary entry. Ba onan codwai contas ar a híl, a nuas gnu neje cuijig agus star honrin na Gaelic a enchint. The same as what I've said in English. In the context of today's talk, Hyde's diary entries would seem to indicate that New York and the US were more favourable for the promotion of Irish than Dublin. It is no surprise, therefore, that the seeds of the revival were equally nurtured on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed that it was Hyde's speech to the Gaelic Society in New York on June 16, 1891, which was published in the Gaelic American on June 27th, which laid the foundation for the philosophy which the Gaelic League would embrace in 1893. What happened with this was then that much of this speech had such an impact that it reached the Irish newspapers, and through English. It was very important that they had to use English to get the message across to begin with. And actually, one of the people who read those accounts in the English language press in Ireland, and I'm leaving you to read it there yourself, is that one of the, it was Owen MacNeill and Owen O'Growney, another founder of the Gaelic League. And they, Owen MacNeill in turn asked Owen O'Growney, Father Owen O'Growney, asked Owen MacNeill then to write a treatise on something that would form a new language movement. And he put a 13-point article together in the Ecclesiastical Record, subsequently published in the Gaelic Journal, and from then it took off. So this was really, there was quite a significance to the media output. I'll read maybe a little bit. I think it's quite long, but I do think it's important because it sets the scene. Now, I want to see the language kept alive for several reasons. First of all, because it is not good for the Irish or any other race to throw sentiment to the dogs. Secondly, I want to see the language kept alive as a great national heritage. Thirdly, as one of the best bonds to knit together the Irish race. And fourthly, because a bilingual race are infinitely superior to a race that speaks only one language. And he goes on to tell us about America, the traditions, and how Catholicity was actually linked. And bearing in mind that he was the son of a Protestant minister, and that religion was not a factor of the Gaelic League, that all creeds and all political interests were welcomed. It was not political and it was not religious based. So, and he says, just to say down at the bottom, or halfway down, do you believe that Americans will think the worse of you for this, or that such a training will unfit you for a place in this vast and glorious republic? I tell you no. 1,000 times no. Respect yourselves and America will respect you. America will greedily wants to assimilate all that is best of the characteristics of the various races that inhabit her soul. How can she respect us if we throw sentiment to the dogs and hang our head and give up what every other nation, even little Switzerland, even tiny Denmark, hold most dear, and so on. We in Ireland owe a great deal to the Gaels of America, for if it were not for the help that we get from them, the Irish language movement would not have assumed the position it now occupies. He gave this lecture, as I said, on the return from the visiting professorship in New Brunswick, and it was printed, as I said. And he finally then gave his lecture on the necessity for de-Anglicising Ireland, which was delivered in Dublin in November 1892, and this is noted as the cornerstone on which the philosophy for the Gaelic League was founded. And I think it is proper, perhaps, to read this. When we speak of the necessity for de-Anglicising the Irish nation, we mean it not as a protest against imitating what is best in the English people, for that would be absurd, but rather to show the folly of neglecting what is Irish and hastening to adopt pell-mell and indiscriminately everything that is English simply because it is English. This is a question which most Irishmen will naturally look at from a national point of view, but it is one which ought also to claim the sympathies of every intelligent unionist, and which, as I know, does claim the sympathy of many. If we take a bird's eye of our island today and compare it with what it used to be, we must be struck by the extraordinary fact that the nation which was once, as everyone admits, one of the most classically learned and cultural nations in Europe, is now one of the least so. How one of the most reading and literary peoples has become one of the least studious and most unliterary. And how the present art products of one of the quickest, most sensitive and most artistic races on earth are now only distinguished for their hideousness. So prior to these speeches, we look at some of his diary entries, and I just look at these. These are manuscript material that I looked at. His diary is in the National Library of Ireland, and these relate, starting off with the Lunasa, which is August 1878. So this is prior to this. Now, I've given you the Irish there because I think it's important just to see the Irish. I'll read out the English for you and you can make it out. But it was a particular type of tongue at the time. It wasn't standardised the way it is today. It wasn't classical Irish the way it was in the time of the Bard. It was somewhere in between. And it's in that Irish that we can see the wealth of the revival movement. So just to translate some of it quickly. Thomas O'Neill Russell, and I do this because the people he mentions in these diary entries, clearly when he was in the States and when he wasn't in the States, he was in contact with that group of people, that Irish-American cohort who were trying to promote the Irishness for the emigrant community. Thomas O'Neill Russell sent me a paper, it's about, the fourth line. Sent me a paper from America yesterday which had Gaelic printed and much news about the way that the Irish language is coming on in that country. It lifted my heart greatly. When I returned from France, I heard that Russell and his people had a victory for the cause and that Irish will be taught in the schools henceforth under the plan of awards for masters who teach Irish well to students. This was a great victory, and Father Nolan told me that many people think that this has saved the language. I won't go any further than that, that's enough. So literally we're seeing that he is aware of what's going on in the US. Secondly, the next is now, this, believe it or not, is Douglas Hyde. Also, for those of you who haven't seen this before, this is Douglas Hyde in Canada. In New Brunswick, this was taken. So we see a very different, a younger man, of course, as well, but out with his goloshes and, you know, ready for the weather and ready to undertake whatever had to be taken. And this was printed in the Dublin University Review in August 1886. A great part of the integrity of Irish nationality in the New World is due to the cultivation of Ireland's old language, which Pro Pudor has found a more congenial soil in the squares of New York than in the streets of Dublin. So strong is the feeling in America in favour of an attempt to preserve what many people feel there to be the most seductive thing that Irish nationality can present them with, that even the New York Herald, the leading newspaper in America, opened its columns the other day to a portion of a speech spoken in Irish by some prominent patriot in New York, which is not only printed in Irish as delivered, but also in the native type, which is very, very unusual. Have we lived to see it? Are they less materialistic over there beyond the seas than we are at home? Does the New York Herald actually do for us what the United Ireland obstinately refuses to do? So then we move on to the manuscript material. Now these are taken directly, and I've still to edit a little bit of these, but I tried to edit as much as I could for coming over here. So, if people are taking notes or anything, this needs further editing, but I've tried my best to be as accurate as I could. These are interesting mainly from the point of view, and they're from 1890, March 1890, until January 1893. Now, bearing in mind that the Gaelic League was founded in 1893. And it shows the mindset he demonstrates after leaving New Brunswick, making his way to Boston and New York. And they demonstrate also the relationship and the connection between the Irish in Boston and those in New York, particularly perhaps O'Donovan Rossa, one of the main Fenians, who was quite a rebellious and quite a controversial character in his own right. But I'll let you read those. I think they're clear enough to be able to read. And I'll go down to number 10 perhaps, because I'm conscious of time. Yeah, we're okay though. So I will read number 10. Went to the Everett House, Union Square, near the centre of New York. Met a man from Ohio and went with him to see the Statue of Liberty, presented to America by France, and so large that 12 men could stand around the torch held in the right hand. Went to Central Park on the elevated railway, and Honeycomber, the Jai Mila and Uachthar Chomunch on the Garshtiv. The reason I say this is because if we notice anything to do with the Irish in New York, he has that in Irish language, which, you know, he's really making the connection even in his own diary back at that point. So we saw 1,000 people driving the carriages. When I got back, I found on Rushialach, Pádraig O'Byrne was one of the poets in New York at the time, who actually was a native of Donegal and actually learned to write Irish in New York, and was a native Irish speaker. So, agus Rogu Lom, I was taken on to come on the Gaelic at the Irish Society, agus vi me leogaji a doig agus dólamar bagan. We were there till 12 and we drank a little. Vi luchara an war an Rushila Misha Eshkinch. Russell was very pleased to see me. 11, Russell breakfasted with me and I spent most of the day with him and come on the Gaelic at the Gaelic Society. Hunted in vain for O'Donovan Rossa, so we obviously was out to meet O'Donovan Rossa, Arashna or Reagan, as we say in Irish, one way or another. Spent the evening with Pádraig very pleasantly, ag all as a kainch, a walya, ag a doig. And then we go on, turned into number 12, turned into Common the Gaelic later on. Té leis an Rushialach agus mar an cainche leis agus leis an díanamh eile godanach an a lot of tea, a lot of talk, basically. And so they're basically the others. Now, I can make these available if anybody wants them afterwards. I can give them to Joseph or Owen for reference. Number 13 in here, we have O'Donovan Ross. I always feel I'm a person who likes to put a face on people, and even with my very last slide today, you'll see what I mean, because we talk about a lot of these people, and I think it's important to be able to make them people as opposed to figures, historic, and that's where I think that thing about going into our history and the native history and what Brian O'Croher, what I said at the beginning, I think that really, it's not antiquarianism, it's to find out who we are sometimes. Sorry, going on to this then, and it is in Irish, so I've translated. I went to O'Donovan Rossa, finally, he found him, in the morning, and we had a long talk and drinks, and he took me to Patrick Ford, in the Irish world. And this is important in the context of the journalistic web. And I had a long talk with him. And when I come to the point of the immigrant press later, you'll see the significance of this. I went to Harlem and saw a baseball match, and I didn't stay long. The heat was 90 in the shade. Then I went to the Irish Society, drank with Walsh, had dinner with Russell. We went together to listen to Irish music in Madison Hall with the Gillamurra band. It was the biggest hall I was ever in. Great music. Home at 11. Okay. So, and more manuscript material here, and we're coming to the end of it now. And these are all again in Irish, but I'm just going to read a few of them. Number 15 there. A bright hot day, 113 in the sun and 95 in the shade. Now that was quite significant for an Irish man from the west of Ireland in Roscommon, I can tell you. I bought guns and bullets and went to Niagara. In the evening I went to the Gaelic Society. Now bearing in mind the time of this was quite an adventure. So I mean, this man was not going to found a language movement that was going to be based on something that was really based in a narrow mindset. It was going to have to be wider and inclusive. They had a feis for me, 15 to 20 people there speaking Irish. They had a nice supper, so I'm going to run through them because I'm conscious of time, but I would like to read them. Wine with ice punch, we drank a lot. There was as much, if not more, talk through Irish as English. Very interesting for the time. And they all praising me. We stayed talking and drinking until 3 in the morning. I wasn't drunk, but I had enough to drink. 6 of them came back to the hotel with me at 4 a.m. Now, this was our President of Ireland in 1938, remember, as well. So he was a human being. Russell came to me, number 16, and took me to Mademoiselle Capucci without anything to eat. Fine weather, 100 in the shade. A big meeting of the Gaelic Society in the evening. I talked in Irish and English. Coleman in the chair. People kissed my hand and they all shook hands with me. There at 12, home at 12, drinks. 21. I spoke well, I believe. Very humble. A lot of people spoke there. Afterwards, we went out to Talchin with O'Donovan Ross, and I was welcomed and had a good dinner and a nice girl before me and a lot of punch and cigars, talked till 10 at night, home to the Gaelic Society with Russell and some doctor. 23, I went out to O'Donovan Rossa, talked and drank with him, took me up to the top of the Herald building, I think, from what I can make out in the manuscript, where I saw the whole city. So basically, they're kind of the manuscript which basically made the founding of it. And I've one final one, and this is in 1894. And this is when he's back in Ireland in Cork, and it's interesting. O'Murrocha took me with him to the Cork Young Men's Society where the Gaelic League meeting was taking place. They offered me an address, no Gilagra, that would have been a common kind of source of honour at the time to have an address to present somebody with a Gilagra. And it was framed in oak, written on parchment, and a poem by Stundimach, I still have to try and make that out, framed in the same way. I talked for a long time in Irish and in English, and they understood me well. I then gave a lecture on Irish literature over the last 300 years. There was warm applause, a great enthusiasmus, and the only place I ever received as warm a welcome as I received there was in New York. Perhaps O'Glaisine, Father O'Leary, O'Sullivan, young Fleming and many others were there, home by 12 with O'Murrocha. So we see there was a very distinct link between the States and Ireland in his own thought process and the founding of the League. So looking on to the Irish language material and the press, the second part in Ireland, we can see now this is actually, and Clive Sullish, which would have been the main Irish language newspaper, which was founded by the Gaelic League in 1899, well 1898 for a start with Fáinne and Lay, then 1899 and Clive Sullish, and they joined together in 1900 and Clive Sullish was Fáinne and Lay. But if I couldn't get it close enough to see it, I probably should have tried a little bit harder, but if you look just in the little box there, you can just see there's Andoin Her, and on the other one there's Andoin Here. So it's the Eastern world and the Western world, and that was just to give you an idea of the titles. Titles and columns in newspapers indicate that the concept of identity for the Irish immigrant was not specific to one domain. And 50 years of titles indicate that they were Hal or a was, Amalia or again, at home or away. And clearly columnists did not view the material related to the international community as completely separate from the native one. This forged links between those who viewed the Irish language as a preservation project and those who saw it as a real possibility for reinstating an element of identity which would supplement rather than burden further the understanding of the modernisation of the Irish people of the 20th century in a global context. For the purpose of this study, the Irish language press is categorised into the organs of the pre-revival and revival movement, the local and national English language press of the era, and the immigrant press in North America. Initial findings indicate that on the one hand, the Irish language revival movement was creating a subculture in the development of a society where self-determination and self-sufficiency within a community context was to the fore, while on the other hand, this self-sufficiency was not limited to linguistic or geographical borders. It was in fact rooted in a societal and cultural infrastructure which created pathways for the ideals to flourish, which was central to the implementation of the ideology of the language revival, be it Hal, there, or a was here. Journalistic evidence from Irish language sources in the press within the framework of this ideology of the revival movement indicates that the new identity would be closely linked to the formation of a transatlantic Irish psyche, which was at the core of the language revival movement. The role of journals and newspapers facilitated the migration process, establishing links for emigrants while coming to terms with a new hybrid identity. Links to the native language formed part of that identity chain. Using this perspective and rationale for news reporting, Irish news should probably have been under the foreign news there in the United States. But a study of material in the American newspapers shows that it too had a cultural and community focus, which was perceived as local as opposed to foreign news, strengthening the relationship between the home and immigrant community, instead of focusing solely on creating new connections within the adopted country and a new consciousness. The journalistic web reveals new perspectives on the global revival process, bringing fresh interpretations to the concept of citizenship and identity. So, looking at Irish language usage in the English press in Ireland, the use of periodicals and newspapers from the pre-revival Bullock and Tuller to the revival journals secured a place for the subsequent presence of the Irish language as part of the communication revolution of the early 20th century. If the focus was to change from that of language preservation to the living language of the people, the creation of a public discourse and communication networks in the public sphere of the media was essential. The content of newspapers and periodicals shows that the revivalist mindset was viewed in a global framework as opposed to one which was solely rooted in narrow nationalistic principles. So was the viewpoint of the Gael and the insights provided in Irish society as delivered in the idiom of the Irish language of this period, shaping a new language or a new ideology on public discourse in the Irish language and on the evolving new society? The debates on language issues are very prominent in the native press, with detailed accounts of related activities, providing insights to a subculture on an Irish language-rooted community, which was not necessarily native-speaking, functioning at many levels of society. The fundamental focus on communication in the immigrant press also serves as a subtext to the revival discourse, allowing for a broader interpretation of the concept of language revival. Despite a minority readership and output, Irish language in the media forum in the revival period was used for most areas of public discourse, as is evident here in the Irish Independent. And it's an interesting study in its own, the Gaelic column in the Irish Independent, because it was the Irish Independent was taken over by a man called William Martin Murphy in 1905, and he was better known for the stand he took for the employers in the 1913 lockout, the Dublin lockout for the employees. But interestingly enough, the Irish Independent, when it was founded, promoted Gaelic identity and Irishness, and prior to that, the Weekly Freeman would have been the main newspaper. But in 1915, and I particularly looked at this, the weekly circulation of the Weekly Freeman was about 30 to 35,000. The weekly circulation of the Irish Independent was 100 to 110,000. So when you put that in context of the readership that this particular column, the Gaelic column, would have been reaching, it's significant. The first Irish language revival period in newspaper were preceded by Gaelic columns in regional newspapers, many of which continued through the 20th century. But the best and most prolific of these was edited by John Glynn in the Tuam News and Western Advertiser in the 1870s. Until recently, reviewing material in English newspapers in Ireland, it was generally asserted that reports of Gaelic League activities and the endorsement of its philosophy reflected contemporary Irish Ireland enthusiasm in this forum. But more recent research indicates that these columns in the revival period also functioned at a broader level. The Irish Independent and the Weekly Freeman, for example, engaged with current and topical issues of the day. These sources are useful in the study of what may be termed as the emergence of the subculture referred to earlier. Ongoing research indicates that the subculture, through the work of the Gaelic League, Timmery, the agents, in conjunction with the county councils of the time, sustained many rural communities in a broader sense, which entailed much more than language maintenance alone. Language was the tool for communication, but in the context of a revival, it was also an emblem of community and identity. The social aspect of this subculture went beyond language maintenance and revival alone, which subsequently assigned an economic value to the language and inadvertently assisting the post-revival movement in the mid-20th century. It is unfortunate, though, that this has really only merited a footnote in revival history to date. So looking at the first Irish language, Bolg an Tuller was 1795. Then we had Fíor Éireannach, we had Ancient Ireland, a weekly magazine in the early 1800s. But the first Irish language journal to which Douglas Hyde subscribes the beginning of the Gaelic League and the revival movement was Irish Lorna Gaeilge, as you see here on your right, and that is the Gaelic Journal, and it was founded in 1880, but in 1882. But parallel to the 1882 Gaelic Journal, and Gael on your left-hand side was in Brooklyn in 1881, founded by Michael Logan, a man who came from Clifton, an emigrant from Clifton, who actually had started the Fellow Celtic Societies in 1872 by an advertisement in the Irish World, and had tried to promote all that. And with that, he eventually founded An Gael then. So we see these two parallel with each other, and when we look at the content of them, it's very interesting. The first Irish language periodical, although sporting a primarily scholarly focus on your right, reports on events in the United States as Irish language news. Many reports and lists of newspapers with Irish content and accounts of events, for example, demonstrate a clear interdependence between media platforms on both sides of the Atlantic. The account of Father O'Growney's welcome to New York in 1895 is one example of this, and I'll just show it to you here, in the Gaelic Journal in 1895. Noteworthy here is the reference to the three societies, and the use of Irish at the gatherings focuses on the influence of the Irish abroad on those at home instead of the other way around. So I'll just read the last little bit. I'll leave it to yourselves to read the others. The common thread here is the use of Irish at these gatherings as well. In writing home, Father O'Growney has expressed with great delight the spirit and earnestness manifested by the Friends of the Gaelic League in America. He says that those working in the same cause at home should take increased courage from the attitude of their American fellow workers who are watching eagerly the progress of the movement in the old land. Clearly, the space created for transmission of the language via these societies in North America was important in the network it provided for the global Irish community. The last page of the Gaelic Journal in the 1890s generally gave a list of newspapers with Irish language content under the heading The Gaelic Papers. This did not separate Irish language content. And there are also references to supporting the Irish language press in Ireland with cheques, quote, to be applied towards defraying the cost of publication of the Gaelic Journal, and with acknowledgement to the Cumann na Gaeilge in New York again. Generally, the subscription list for the Oireachtas Fund, which was the Irish Language Literary and Cultural Festival, which was founded in 1897, also has as many subscribers from the United Kingdom and the United States as Ireland, while regular reportage of Irish language usage of meetings is also recorded. Some examples include an account of the establishment of the London branch of the Gaelic League in October 1896 and the establishment or the Celtic Revival article by M.A. O'Byrne of New York to the Catholic World for March, along with the announcement of new branches in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Detroit and Michigan. One of the better examples of the coverage of the angle of the movement in the United States in Irish Lorna Gaeilge refers to the first Oireachtas. Now, this is just an advertisement for the Oireachtas as well, and this blew me away when I read it, actually, because I feel it epitomises to some extent how it was being viewed in the States. Mr. Patrick O'Byrne, who we referred to earlier, Pádraig Byrne of the Gaelic Society in New York, was present at a meeting of the Central Branch. I'll just run through parts of it. In returning thanks, Mr. O'Byrne dealt with the present position of the movement in America and said, "Your Oireachtas was, I think, taken up better by the press in America than anything that has happened on this side of the Atlantic for some time past. The novelty appealed to them. The very idea of the Irish people having a literary competition in their own language in Dublin was so extraordinary that they eagerly took notice of it. They in America were happy that such a very large measure of success had attended the efforts of the Gaelic League in establishing an institution having for its object the literary cultivation of the tongue of our fathers. He considered that there were two great reasons which should induce every Irishman to join the movement for the preservation of the Irish language. First, it offered a common platform to those of different shades of political and religious thought, and secondly, that it formed a strong bond of union between the Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland and Wales." Okay. While this piece acknowledges the common religious and political platform provided by the Oireachtas, it also echoes the magnitude of a movement like this as referred to by Sean O'Tuama earlier. 75 years, it was actually 75 years later in the Gaelic League, but I referred to it earlier. In that the Gaelic League idea may well have been better understood in the States than in the home country. The endorsement in the main Irish language journal of this unified approach transcending geographical borders was important at the time. The reportage and discourse in these journals is significant, therefore, in the attempt to determine the multifaceted nature of the identity of immigrant communities and the understanding of the citizenship which they envisaged for themselves within their new country. Indeed, Margaret Beetham has long argued that, quote, "Each article, each periodical number was and is part of a complex process in which writers, editors, publishers and readers engaged in trying to understand themselves and their society. That is, they struggled to make their world meaningful." The early discussion on the foundation of the first Irish language newspaper and Clive Sullish agus Fáinne Lay clearly shifts the ownership of the language with the hope that both new and traditional Irish speakers would be tested in this forum for the creation of an Irish reading public. I leave you to read this yourselves, as opposed to the previous focus on the use of the periodical forum as a reply or a protest. They were now testing the reading public themselves. Owen MacNeill recognised that a weekly newspaper, and this is his article, was a necessary tool if the Irish language and cultural revival movement were to flourish, and that the movement would possibly lose ground if this were not the case. An overview of some of the content of Clive Sullish as the first Irish language national newspaper also demonstrates a significant diversity of subject matter. These writers could not discuss or provide reports on these subjects without having some concept of internationalisation and of the importance of broadening this Gaelic mindset at home and abroad. Furthermore, this was not based on speculation and musing alone and was viewed as important at the time, as discussed in Clive Sullish. And here, this is actually in Clive Sullish. That's, we can see the ornate and I used both titles there because the Fáinne Lay was the breaking of the day, and that was used as a symbolic emblem in quite a lot of the newspapers and periodicals of the time. And I haven't time to do this today, but I actually give a talk in Cork this year solely based on the titles of these periodicals, and actually some of them are hugely artistic and very, very insightful as to the content and the way that it was communicated. The international content in Clive Sullish reflects a wide variety of topics and countries under review. Some of the material related to language movements and official structures would subsequently be instrumental in the formation of the ideology and identity of the new state. In order to influence people and the public opinion, however, reportage was consistently acknowledged as the key element in the diffusion of the revivalist ideology. And so we're up now as far as the beginning of and Clive Sullish lasted from 1899 to 1932. And parallel to that then, we've looked at the Irish language, the ideology for it, the ideology for the Gaelic League movement. We've looked at the press in Ireland. I'm now going to move to the immigrant press. And yeah, I have about 10 minutes, I think, so I'll go through this just reasonably quickly. But so this is the immigrant press now. In practice, as Thomas McConmee says, if no other border is deemed to be as effective as a language border, an examination of the various forms of language usage is pertinent to setting the boundaries of the new life of the immigrant in a new language world. If a language world is, and I quote, an environment or cultural ecology which plays a role in one's personality, identity, which forms his relationships and his thoughts there, remembers all that he has learned from the time of his youth, from parents, friends, books that he has read, all in one language, unquote, what cultural baggage did emigrants carry or discard to deal with this new language world within the new geographical landscape? Adopting the language of the new country was viewed as central to good citizenship, as demonstrated in an article in the Irish American in 1857, which is here in front of you, which links cultural preservation to the difficulty in acquiring citizenship in another country. The writer advises immigrants to adhere to their native language despite the difficulties with citizenship. However, despite the fact that newspaper and manuscript evidence indicates that Irish language was in use in the context of reportage on events in the United States as early as the period of the American Revolution in North America, according to Thomas the Hyde in New York University, when an act regarding language signage was passed in 1848 to help immigrants to settle in, Irish was not one of the languages listed. In that year, approximately 151,000 Irish immigrants entered the city of New York. The omission of Irish for signage translation to help immigrants to settle into their new country ignores an apparent long tradition, however scant, of the use of language, as Buttimer and O'Hija tell us here. Current research on newspaper material is inconsistent, although it is mainly understood that the Irish language column was not evident prior to the Irish American column in 1857, and I'll be spending the next couple of days hopefully looking at these newspapers in the New York Library. Some quotes and sources indicate that the first newspaper to have had Irish language content was the Shamrock or Hibernian Chronicle in New York in 1810, but there is mixed evidence on Irish language content in US newspapers. It may be said that this is the most conclusive list that I have come up with to date from various sources and from looking at papers myself. It is probably safe to assume, therefore, that Irish language content itself is sparse prior to the columns such as those in the Irish American, but debate on Irish language and its role in Irish culture and in the American culture was quite prevalent. The use of Irish language in North American-based newspapers increased between 1848 and around 1870, with some Irish language content in the Oneida Morning Herald, the Mohawk Courier, the New York Herald, which of course coincides with societies, the New York Sun and the Corrector. There are quite a few references also to the use of Irish in the Fenian newspapers in America, and this is indicated by the quote. I've translated this from Fionnuala Ilanagine's book on the Fenians in America. At the very least, this raises questions as to why the immigrant community would employ this dead literary language in public forums in their adopted country. A question which goes beyond the understanding of language maintenance alone. Firstly, clearly literacy was an issue. Secondly, unlike the native press in Ireland, in the United States, the lack of orthographical consistency seems to be more of a basic literacy issue than that of linguistic or political debate. For example, in Ireland, they used the Gaelic script as the symbol for the nationalism and whatever, even though it was brought in by Queen Elizabeth I. But whereas in the States, it seems really to have been solely a literacy issue. If the Irish immigrant had to abandon the language and culture to integrate fully into the new community and engage in the new psyche of the new country, the language seemed to take on a new role in their new identity and lives, as referred to at the start of this talk. This further reinforces the importance of close examination of these literary sources and writing practices as linguistic and societal commentary and as instruments in furthering present perspectives on citizenship as opposed to historical evaluation alone, as I've said earlier. Ken Nilsson was one of the most prolific scholars in this area, and Ken passed away while I was in Canada, and I had the fortune to meet with him and do some work before he passed away, but he was an excellent scholar and he was the leader in this area. He did excellent work on the Irish American, and he said that it had been largely overlooked. So I'll just take a quick look at the Irish American. This is key to understanding the function of the journalistic form, which did not overemphasise language accuracy, and may account for the lack of attention in these sources to date. Indeed, the font and spelling issues were the source of much controversy, which in reality cloaked more in-depth questions of culture, nation and identity among the right-wing element of the revival movement. Not so in America. One of the things that is noted, the death of the renowned poet Pádraig Condún in 1857, and many of his poems published in the Irish American in 1858. There were approximately 450 Irish language columns in the newspaper by 1881, and this actually is very helpful because Douglas Hyde correlates the founding of the revival movement with the founding of Irish Lorna Gaelic, or the Gaelic Journal, in 1882. That's almost 50 years after the first Gaelic column in America, so we do need to review this, mirroring the ancient tradition of the File. As a result of Irish classes and the result of the column itself, a new forum was gradually being established for Irish speakers and writers to practice the craft of writing, even though they were native speakers. The forum in the United States therefore recognised the two publics, the established native Irish speaker and the enthusiastic learner. And as I mentioned earlier, for example, Patrick O'Byrne, a native Irish speaker from Donegal, was one of those who learned to write Irish in New York, reflecting another aspect of the literary progression of Irish immigrants and the need to make the spoken language a literary print language to ensure its survival as a voice of this new community. It is worth noting that O'Byrne is hailed as one of the most famous Irish language poets of that period in the revival in the United States. The end of the Irish American then came at about 1915, and then, as I said, we had the Gael simultaneously being published at this time. But the main function of the Irish language presence in this milieu was to provide a voice for the immigrant, reinstating their ownership of the language. By doing this, it acknowledged its role in the hybrid identity of the immigrant in the United States. And Martin O'Kane, one of our prolific Irish writers of the 20th century, would state about An Gael, despite the fact, and you can read it yourselves, but at the end, despite the fact that it is modern literature about modern affairs in a modern style, above all else it belongs to us, the only voice of our own that we as Gaels have, thanks to the Gaelic League. So he did put some emphasis on this. It may well have been clumsy, but as the only voice of their own in a milieu where language diversity was perceived at the time as perhaps unhelpful to the official institutions and where literacy was becoming increasingly important, it played a significant role in the communication network and in the legacy it left. The immigrant newspaper Idrich, the Mirror, which was printed around the same time in New York, is another example of the public sphere of the media in defining identity for the Welsh immigrant in this instance. And I leave it to you to read it yourselves. Just one final newspaper that I would like to comment on the other side of the US, one of the more interesting examples from the point of view of public discourse in Irish language journalism in the New World is the Monitor, founded in San Francisco, 1878 to 1920, again looking at Hyde's diaries and the Times, by Father Peter York, who he was editor for a period, and Mary Butler, the Irish correspondent, all Gaelic League. The paper seems to have crossed all boundaries as an instrument in the global revival process. Butler was a contributor to An Clive Sullish. She had a column on Irish language affairs in the Irish Daily Independent, which merged into the Irish Independent afterwards, but her column was 1899. And although this was mostly written in English, she was also the Irish correspondent for the Pittsburgh Post and the Philadelphia Leader. So York's role in the Monitor is described then as energetic, fearless and sometimes overzealous, and just to look at the connection between Mary Butler in this context as well. Now I won't read this, but it's actually it's a quote from two people who have done wonderful research on York and the Monitor, and Walsh and Foley, so I leave it to yourself. But just to summarise a little bit on it, he actually Father York was quite outspoken and quite bold, and he used the forum mainly to promote his own ideas and perhaps to be a dissenting voice against the hierarchy and against the establishment. And perhaps instead of using the paper for the ideals of the movement and whatever, he actually had to be taken out. So at this time, the press took on a new importance for Irish leaders in America, with almost all Irish populations having their own ethnic press. And interestingly, York gave a speech in the ancient concert rooms in September 1899 in Dublin, and as a result, he called it the turning of the tide. And as a result of that speech, the founding of the Keatings branch of the Gaelic League was founded. But the Keatings branch, I'm not sure if you're aware, it was the main Munster branch, and very prolific Irish scholars and great Irish, but also one of purported to be one of the greatest breeding grounds for the recruitment of the Irish Republican Brotherhood at the time. So there was a bit of a rebellion element there, I suppose. The international, and I'm coming to the close now, the international reportage regarding language revival in the States and the milieu in which it was fostered was becoming as important as what was happening in Ireland. York was a controversial character in this domain who would not be silenced by the restraints of his ministry or otherwise. If challenging the authorities was a factor of immigrant communities, he was up for the challenge, and this forum afforded him a freedom which his ministry did not. In 1899 also, thinking back now on Hyde's visit to Ford, Ford's Irish World continued with discussion on the value of the Irish language as an ancient language in the first place and then as a living language. In 1879, the Irish community in Brooklyn convinced the management of the Irish World that they should publish Irish language pieces regularly, as documented in Hyde's diary mentioned earlier. The Gaelic column, or the Irish department, was not implemented, however, until 1899. Although it did not have a strong Irish column, there was significant amount of discussion on the provision of Irish language classes and on various societies. And of course, we say that that is the beginning of the Philo-Celtic societies, as mentioned earlier. Then in Boston in 1886, the movement had taken root, and the Journal of the Philo-Celtic Society of Boston, the Irish Echo, was issued in January. And there was much publication of this, and that's just a quick of what was in the Irish Echo. It is important, however, to recognise that Irish was being acknowledged at other levels in the United States at this stage, with the foundation of the Professorship of Celtic in the Catholic University in Washington the following year in 1895, and the foundation of the first Irish courses in Harvard in 1896. Again, interesting in the context of the entries in Hyde's diary. A modern intellectual mindset was coming to the fore, which was probably the result of the global, or at least a transatlantic, revival process. Much work has to be done on the comparative element of this material in order to fully assess this material, and we're only starting on it. But much work has been done by Nicholas Wolfe also in New York University on particular catchment areas of spoken language in the 1900s, early 1900s. Clearly, the link between language, identity and citizenship was a source of some conflict in the revival period at home and abroad, but as the debate on language gained momentum, the Irish language content in the papers gained more significance in strengthening the revival movement in both domains. And this is Martin O'Kane again, and he refers specifically to the content of newspapers strengthening the movement. So to conclude, and I literally have 2 pages here to read to conclude, so if you can bear with me for the final. In the context of understanding revival ideology and the creation of a living language, the analysis of the role and content of media sources is in the embryonic stages, and international dimension of the revival period has not yet been fully assessed. Clearly, however, even at this stage, an analysis of this kind demonstrates that this was not merely a movement on the margins, but a movement which was rooted in global and indeed transatlantic understandings and language, which envisaged that a marginalised mindset would not be part of the living language and of the community to which it belonged. Whether the forum itself was fostered in the Dóin-Thir, the Eastern world, or in the Dóin-Thir, here, the Western world, in a transatlantic context, whether drawing on traditional writing practices or formulating new modern ways of engaging with reportage, journalistic practice and the styles associated were central to the global and transatlantic process of the revival, which also depended largely on communication and writing forums and practices prior to the revival period. The role of journals and newspapers in the creation of a network of sorts of Irish speakers and writers facilitated the migration process, establishing links for emigrants while coming to terms with the new hybrid identity. Links to the native language formed part of the identity chain, and the seeds for a new ideology and public discourse in the Irish language and society were sown at this time. As Ken Nilsson says, and I like to give him one of the final words on this, for the majority of Irish speakers, Irish was the language that was most natural for them to use with family, friends and neighbours. It is an encouraging sign that modern researchers are starting to hear the voices of the many Irish immigrants who arrived in this city, New York at that time, with their language and culture intact. Although the Irish language was not in everyday use, its presence as a visible aspect of the new identity, which allowed the immigrant to be hall agus a was there and here at the same time, merits more than a footnote. And finally, just in putting this in the context of the contemporary context of the decade of centenaries, it is important to revisit the reply from which the Gaelic League regarded the perceived political identity of 1916 as non-political, and this was in Enclave Sullish in August of 1916. the Gaelic League and its critics, it's called. The pleas of the leader writers are that the League has become virtually a political organisation. The revival of the native language in Ireland is in the first place a national question. Ireland is a small nation, which has had a language of her own as long as she has had a history. And if a member of the Gaelic League suffers death for his religious or political principles, we mourn his loss and cannot think less of his work for the revival of the Irish language because he has proved himself a man of courage in other spheres of action. The Gaelic League has always kept an open door for all Irish-born men and women who want to help the language revival and has never imposed any religious or political test. As a matter of fact, unionists have been and are amongst our most zealous workers. The Gaelic League might, if it chooses, at any time convert itself into an organisation of a religious or political character. And it has not done so because its members believe that there is no religious body or political party in Ireland that should not feel its duty to furnish its quota to the work of the revival of the national language. The technological advances where writing practices are no longer curtailed by borders, be they linguistic or physical geographical borders, indicate that it is time to rethink and ensure the preservation and nurturing not only a generation of writers, but a generation of thinkers. It is in this context, therefore, that the new Gaelic idea needs to be examined and that the hybrid identities of the Irish revival need to be acknowledged. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I forgot, but these are the pictures and these are the people. Sorry, I just wanted to put a face on a lot of the people that I've talked about so you can, I won't go into them, but again, I can give this PowerPoint to Owen and to Joseph if need be. So.
Do you have a question? I know people have classes and other things that they have to get to. But do people have questions?
That's fine. Okay.
I can give you a question.
Okay, Joseph.
I'm wondering about a couple of things. One, for immigrants who came over, the teaching of the language to the next generation. Do we see much commentary, or do we see people exhorting Irish speakers to do that, or is it understood that this will be a language that will last a generation in America and then disappear?
At the time of the revival, Joseph, much of that.
In in Springfield, Massachusetts, or other places where the language endures as a community, as sort of the blood of the community, and keeping people together. And we'll see the Ancient Order of Hibernians or other places having language classes. But do we see much commentary talking about that? In
the print material, yes, there would be a lot of that. In particular, Michael Logan and Gael, I mean, it's full of it. Irish, and then I mean they published Eoin O'Grownie's Simple Lessons in Irish. That when that became published, of course, that infused a complete new learning process in Irish because people actually had a text. I mean, that's why I think sometimes this enthuses me, or perhaps when I came into this in the beginning as a younger researcher, that what they did, I mean, really, Irish language was primarily a peasant language at the time. Now, that is not using the word peasant in any way as a derogatory term, but that was the system because you had to be from a certain hierarchy to avail of literary language at the time. So the peasants were counted, perhaps the farmers and the fishermen, and that is where the language became embedded, and that is what survived through those 300 years, because they knew to create a new mindset of a colony, of course, you had to be able to communicate with these people in the language of the colony, not as in the language of the people who were being colonised, we'll say. But clearly there was no need to do this. It was perceived that there was no need to do this in the west of Ireland. But all along, and they often say there's the divide is north and south in Ireland. The divide is more east and west because there is more of a link to Irish language in the East. It's not acknowledged, but another register of language was in use practically throughout that 300 years, we have found manuscript material where the newspapers were used in the manuscript material and vice versa. So it actually was alive as a literary language to some extent throughout that time. But the interesting thing about the States was that they recognised that it needed to become. They weren't going to revive it as a spoken language. In fact, it was already alive in the spoken language among the immigrants who came here, because many of them had come as Irish speakers, only Irish speakers. So it was very important that it became a literary language, and that is where we need to look at the sources to see, and even the use that Hyde made of the newspapers to spread his message about revival, that it wasn't going to be done only in speeches. So this is a big content of those papers, and the Irish Echo, and they clearly were very much in contact with each other, because a lot of the content in An Gael mirrors the content of the Gaelic Journal. An Gael was in Brooklyn, the Irish Echo in Boston. I mean, all of those, they mirror, and we're still looking at an awful lot of this material. There's an awful lot of work to be done on this, and we had a conference last year on Irish literature in a global context, and we're having one now in 2016 on, we're calling it Tarthaí na Réabhlóide, the results of the revolution, but we're looking at the literary sources and what has come as a result of revival, and as a result of the leadership, perhaps, that these people presented in the context of identity, and what the values of identity and Irishness were. Not necessarily nationality, but Irishness. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, Joseph, but there's certainly loads of evidence of classes. And
also, and it's about the early 19th century, when we think that this is a period where Irish wasn't considered a modern language. It was considered an ancient language.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no dictionaries being written. It wasn't seen as part of the Indo-European family until the 1830s. And there's this gap in there from the 1790s to the 1830s where there's not a consistent effort, except for perhaps getting Protestant missals translated into Irish for people to go out, for Anglicans to go out into the West. Do you see this as being a gap from Charlotte Brooke to post?
No, I actually don't, Joseph.
Yeah,
no.
I'm getting a sense you don't.
Yeah, and that is more and more what this research into periodicals and print material, and another scholar in Galway, a scholar of history but has Irish, Neil O'Kissine, has done some work on the periodicals of that period as well, and we both come to that conclusion that there wasn't a gap at that time, that in fact that is what's coming to the fore more and more, because it wasn't just that the language died in the literary sense and it was kept alive on the western seaboard. Right. It was actually, there is strong evidence, and actually if we look at all the compilations of journals, and that even in the National Library, looking at them now more closely, I mean, it was always the rhyme almost that Bolgan Thuller was the first fear era nach ancient Ireland, but looking at the compilations of journals, we can see clearly there was discourse on Irish language, not necessarily Irish language being used, but to have that discourse, they had to have a knowledge of orthography and the general structures of language as well. It wasn't. It's certainly even in the Gaelic League times, because that was one of the things that when they set up it was set up more as a movement to help and to nurture language, but also to help a society. And actually, some of the Gaelic League, I referred to them earlier, the Timmery, the agents, they were going around as Gaelic League helpers and going around to the Irish-speaking districts and helping people and setting up classes and whatever. In fact, a lot of those agents also were very, very active in helping people in society with in economic terms. And we actually, for the conference next year, we have a few of their grandchildren talking at who have actually published. One woman, Monica Patton, has published a wonderful article on the work of her grandfather as a Gaelic League, and I've come across 4 people have contacted me to date, so I'm hoping to line them up for a panel on that, because I think that's what it's about. And once we have that kind of connection as well, it helps us to get a real picture of what the Gaelic League was about, not just in a linguistic point of view, but in a societal movement. And that's where that wouldn't have happened without a continuation, from the 1700s right through. There was as I said in that, a subculture in the context of the Gaelic League, but I think actually a subtext was being fostered through the journals and that throughout that time prior to the Gaelic Journal and the Gael and those, yeah. So, yeah, thank you.